Anderson, staff and volunteers, I'd like to acknowledge the dignitaries joining us today and also extend a warm welcome to all of the families and friends gathered here for the Veterans March in the nation's capital. The Veterans March, organised by the ACT branch of the Returned and Services League of Australia, will commence shortly. The reviewing officer for today's march will be the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, His Excellency, General the Honourable David Hurley. Now, in a first here at the memorial, the Governor-General will also march this morning alongside the many veterans who have gathered in Canberra to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Australian Defence Force operations in Somalia before taking his position on the saluting dais. Ladies and gentlemen, to signify the start of the Veterans March, we will soon have the pleasure of witnessing a flypast of a C-130 Hercules. And the Hercules approaches now. And with that, the march will commence, supported by the band of the Royal Military College Duntroon and accompanied by members of the band of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. Anzac Day is the day Australians and New Zealanders throughout our nations and across the world remember and reflect upon the landing at Gallipoli in 1915 and the spirit of Anzac, with its human qualities of courage, of endurance, sacrifice, and mateship. These are among our most valued qualities as Australians, and these qualities inspire and bind us together in the face of adversity, and they continue to bring meaning and relevance to our sense of national character and identity. Well, at the head of this march this morning are the Land Rovers carrying our less mobile veterans, Lynette Dizzy Dowsett and Marie Robbins, who served in the Women's Royal Australian Army Corps, and both ladies served overseas in Singapore during the 1960s and 70s. And also Second World War veteran Bern Brent, who turned 100 last December. Happy birthday, Mr. Brent. German-born Bern joined the Army after arriving in Australia aged just 17 aboard the ship the Danera. And during the war, some 2,200 boys and men aged between 16 and 66 were brought to Australia from Britain, becoming known as the Danera Boys. And Mr. Bern is now believed to be the only surviving Danera boy in the country and only one of 5 worldwide. Also today, joining us, the Korean War veterans Ralph Woolmer and Colin Berryman from the Belconnen sub-branch. And driving those vehicles were veterans David Leroyd and Peter Muir. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, if you could applaud those veterans. As we hear the strains of the band approaching, we pay tribute on this day to the service of our veterans during ceremonies and with marches just like this one in cities, towns and remote areas right across the nation and in a number of locations overseas. And we pause to remember those who have served in all of Australia's wars and conflicts, and we remember the families who have supported them and continue to do so. And approaching now is Australian Defence Force Somalia with 450 veterans marching today. And leading the march is the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, His Excellency, General the Honourable David Hurley, who commanded the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment during Operation Solace in 1993. The Australian Service Contingent to the United Nations Operation in Somalia, or AEST UNOSOM, includes Navy, Army and Air Force personnel who supported the contingents 1 and 2. Nearly 200 personnel deployed with UNOSOM over 4 rotations between October 1992 and November 1994 under difficult and dangerous conditions. Australian UNOSOM personnel supported the entire Somalia area of operations, which included not just Somalia, but Djibouti, Kenya, and at times Ethiopia, undertaking a wide variety of tasks. This included movements of personnel coordinating air and sea transportation to support famine relief, as well as UN civil and military operations. There were also Australian personnel employed with the UNOSOM Force Headquarters who operated at the highest levels in key areas of intelligence. Among those marching today are Paul Angelatos, the first soldier into Somalia in October 1992, Greg Jackson, the first officer commanding of the Movement Control Group, Trevor Jones, the first commander of AEST UNOSOM, and Brian Smokey Dawson, who served with the UNOSOM HQ. He's now the Assistant Director of National Collections at the Australian War Memorial. And the parade commander for this morning's march is Mr. John King, President of the Returned and Services League of Australia ACT branch. In the unity of Anzac, John is accompanied today by Captain Blair Gerritsen of the Royal New Zealand Navy Defence Advisor to Australia and India at the New Zealand High Commissioner. We're also joined this morning by the Second World War veteran, Mr. Les Cook, who turned 100 earlier this year. Les enlisted with his father into the army in 1940 and served with the 2nd 14th Battalion in North Africa, Greece, Crete, Syria, as well as in the Pacific, including at Kokoda. He also served as part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan. Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for Mr. Les Cook. Parading today are New Zealand Defence personnel currently serving in Canberra at the High Commission with the Department of Defence or training at various Australian service colleges. And following them are members of Legacy, led by Chris Appleton. Legacy was nationally established with a mission to support and to care for the families of fallen veterans. And this year marks the centenary of Legacy, one of the nation's most respected charities. For 100 years, Legacy has cared for these families, keeping the promise made to a dying soldier at Pozières to look after the missus and the kids. And now approaching is the RSL ACT branch and sub-branches, led by Kimberly Hicks. Formed in 1916, the Returned in Services League of Australia is one of Australia's oldest and most respected organisations. And the ACT branch sits over sub-branches Belconnen, Campbell Russell, Gungahlin, Hellenic, Peacekeepers, Tuggeranong Valley, Vietnamese and Woden Valley. And here comes the Peacekeepers sub-branch, and you'll note the distinctive UN blue beret worn by those members of this sub-branch. Peacekeepers first deployed on operations to Indonesia in 1947. And since that time, more than 50,000 Australians from defence and police have served in operations around the globe. And the Defence contingent, led by Captain Anthony Pisani. Australian Defence Force personnel are currently deployed to operations overseas and within Australia in order to actively protect Australia's borders and offshore maritime interests. Marching today are current serving personnel representing the Royal Australian Navy, along with the Army and Royal Australian Air Force from within the Canberra region. And following the Defence contingent, here comes the National Servicemen's Association, led by John Faunt. And this contingent consists of representatives of the two national service schemes Australia instituted following the Second World War. And they're followed by the Joint Data Network Military Operations Contingent Leader Jason Page, a newly formed team of tri-service personnel responsible for providing military operations support for the Australian Defence Force networks, systems and technologies to enable the Joint Force to achieve mission aims. And here come the Korean War veterans. And marching today is Commodore Norman Lee, who served in the Korean War with 817 Squadron as part of the HMAS Sydney Air Group from 1951 to 1952. And joining Norman is Wing Commander Ted Wilson, who served with the Air Force for 30 years, including with No. 77 Squadron in Japan and Korea between 1950 and 51. And following the career veterans is the HMAS Sydney Association, led by Jim Quick. 5 ships have carried the name Sydney in the RAN. The first served in the First World War. Fruiter's Sydney 4, serving in the Persian Gulf and East Timor, and the current and 5th Sydney, commissioned in 2020. And following the Sydney is Naval Warfare Officers Association, led by Vice Admiral Chris Ritchie. The Naval Warfare Officers Association is comprised of retiring and serving naval officers who have either commanded or served in Australian warships. They're followed by the Naval Association of Australia, led by David Manolis. This association was formed in 1920. And the Fleet Air Arm Association was established in 1948 as they pass now and based at HMAS Albatross near Nowra in New South Wales. And here come the Submarines Association, ACT. Leading the contingent is Commander Dave Strungwood and the ACT branch Patron Captain Ian Noble. And now to the Army with the Royal Australian Artillery Association. The Royal Australian Artillery Association ACT branch is comprising of retired and serving gunners who have served in virtually every operation since South Vietnam. And they're followed by the 107 Battery Association, which was first formed in Sydney in 1915. It served on the Western Front during the First World War and then in the defence of Australia during the Second World War and on operations in Malaysia, Vietnam, Somalia and Timor. And here's the Royal Australian Regiment Association with Brigadier Stephen Dunn, the contingent leader. This association was formed in 1948 and is the professional infantry regiment of the Australian Army. Passing now is the 2nd 4th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, ACT branch, Russell Lowers, the leader, followed by 5 RAR Association with Chris Appleton, leading that contingent. And approaching now is 6th Platoon Bravo Company, 7 RAR. They served in Vietnam from April 1967 to April 68, and their members are captured in the background of that famous image of an Iroquois helicopter landing to pick up members of 5 Platoon B Company, 7 RAR, at the conclusion of Operation Ulmara in August 67. And here's the Australian Army Training Team, Vietnam Association, ACT and Southern New South Wales branch, with the contingent leader Bill Thompson. Simply known as the Team, they consisted of experienced officers and warrant officers who led, trained and advised South Vietnamese troops and paramilitary groups during the Vietnam War. Followed by the Australian Commando Association of the ACT. The Australian Commando Association represents current and former members of Australian Commando units, including the M and Z special units and the independent units of the Second World War. And following them is the Special Air Service Association ACT branch. Approaching now the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, 1970 to 2023. And the contingent comprises past members who have seen service in Vietnam, in Somalia, East Timor, Iraq, the Solomon Islands and Afghanistan. And they're followed by the Royal Australian Signals Association with contingent leader Brigadier Peter Evans. And this association represents all Australian signal associations on this day. And approaching is the Australian Intelligence Corps Association. 50 members marching today, and this corps was formed in 1907, and they've provided support to military operations from the mountains of Kashmir to the deserts of Saudi Arabia, through to the tropical regions of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Followed by the Royal Australian Army Ordnance Corps Association, led today by Brigadier Rebecca Talbot. And let's hear it for the Royal Australian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers Association, ACT, with Contingent Leader Andrew Adams. Approaching is the Royal Australian Engineers Association, ACT, 50 members marching today. Now, this association consists of serving and former serving members of the Corps of the Royal Australian Engineers, located in the ACT. And here comes the Canberra Survey Corps Association, led by Peter Jensen. This corps was formed in 1915 and served as an independent corps until integrated into the Royal Australian Engineers in 1996. And the Royal Australian Corps of Transport passes now. Formed in June 1973, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Royal Australian Corps of Transport, and their contingent is led today by Major General Sue Gray. And here's the Military Police. The Military Police Association Australia, led by Squadron Leader Laurie O'Reilly. Followed by the Royal Australian Army Medical Corps Association, ACT, which was formed in 1903, and it's provided medical service wherever the Australian Army has been committed. And here are the nurses. Australian Defence Force Nursing, 40 members marching today, a contingent of nurses from the Navy, Army and the Air Force, led by the Director of Defence Force Nursing, Group Captain Kath Stein, along with invited guest, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian College of Nursing, Adjunct Professor Kylie Ward. And approaching the Women's Royal Australian Army Corps and Army Women, led by Margaret Flett. The Australian Women's Army Service was formed in 1941. And they're followed by 9 Squadron, led by John Winter today. And approaching is the multinational force and observers, and the contingent leader is Neil Thompson. And here's the Airfield Defence Association, contingent leader Arthur Gale. This group has defended airfields since the Second World War, and today's Airfield Defence Guards figured prominently in East Timor. And they're followed by Number 2 Squadron Association, led by Lance Halverson. This squadron was formed during the First World War as part of the Australian Flying Corps, and it operated over the Western Front. And it's seen action in the Second World War, the Malayan Emergency, the Vietnam War, and that squadron currently operates Boeing 737 Wedgetail aircraft. And here comes Air Force Association, ACT Division, led by Group Captain Ernie Walsh. And the Air Force Association was established in 1920 in the aftermath of the Great War of 1914 to 18. And they're followed by the RAAF Association Wanderers branch with 20 marching today, with the leader, Wing Commander Gordon Purse. And the association's membership is drawn from former and serving members of the Air Transportable Telecommunications Unit, which was raised in 1965. and due to changes in technology, it was renamed Number 1 Combat Communications Squadron on the 1st of July 1999. And its members have deployed to Cambodia, to East Timor, the Solomon Islands, Kyrgyzstan and the Middle East. And approaching is the Vietnam Veterans Federation, led today by Ward Gainey. The Vietnam Veterans Federation comprises veterans from the Royal Australian Navy, Australian Army and the Royal Australian Air Force who served in Vietnam during the period 1962 to 1973. By July 1973, about 60,000 Australian men and women had served in the Vietnam War. Following the Vietnam veterans comes the National Malaya and Borneo Veterans Association, led by Ian Davenport. The association comprises veterans of the Malayan Emergency and the Indonesian Confrontation. They're followed by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Veterans Association, led by Joseph West, and the American and Allied Forces contingent, led by Alicia Doherty. And members of the Australian American Association are marching today to raise awareness of the upcoming 70th anniversary of the Australian American Memorial next year. And they're followed by the civilian peacekeepers and peacemakers. Australian civilians have served on operational deployments since the Second World War. Men and women from the Departments of Defence, Foreign Affairs and Trade, Australian Federal Police, Border Force and other agencies have served with the Defence Force since Vietnam. And here's the South African military veterans of Australasia, led by Carlo Vlok. And ladies and gentlemen, following the South African contingent are the Marshals, our final contingent this morning. And they've ensured all contingents who marched this morning stepped off in the correct order and mostly on the right foot. And the Marshals today are veterans themselves and they're representatives of the ACT-RSL, assisted by staff from the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Australian War Memorial. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the splendid contingents of veterans who have marched today, supported by the band of the Royal Military College, Duntroon. And they've been accompanied by members of the band of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. And may I also acknowledge the veterans who didn't march today, but who have still joined us. Thank you very much. And we also extend our sincere thanks to the Governor-General for reviewing today's Veterans March. To conclude this morning's commemorations, the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, His Excellency General the Honourable David Hurley, will shortly deliver the Anzac Day address. As our veteran marchers rejoin their families to view this address, we reflect on the inception of Anzac Day. Inextricably connected with the landings at Gallipoli in the Dardanelles Strait on the 25th of April 1915, this day commemorates that moment in history when Anzac troops were committed to their first major action of the First World War. In all, more than 130,000 lives were lost during the Gallipoli campaign. Service personnel from Australia, from New Zealand, United Kingdom, Newfoundland, France, India, and the Ottoman Empire paid the ultimate price, with many of these soldiers buried or commemorated alongside one another on the Gallipoli Peninsula. And every year, the Australian and New Zealand governments jointly conduct the Anzac Day commemorations on the shores of Gallipoli, with the permission and the support of the host nation, Turkey. And today, we are honoured to acknowledge and to thank Lieutenant General Kamal Yeni, Commander of the Aegean Army, and Mrs. Asaman Yeni, who have travelled from Turkey to attend today's Anzac Day commemorations here in the nation's capital. And their presence continues a shared commitment to the enduring relationship between Australia and Turkey to this day. I now invite the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, His Excellency, General the Honourable David Hurley, to deliver the Anzac Day address.
Good morning, and thank you all for attending today and supporting our veterans and their families by your presence, by your acclamation. Can I begin by acknowledging we're standing on Ngunnawal country here and pay my respects to elders past and present. This is a beautiful part of Australia, and I thank them for looking after this country for us for generation after generation, and pay respects to elders past and present, and very mindful today of our obligations to the younger generation. Could I acknowledge Her Excellency Ms. Caroline Kennedy, Ambassador of the United States of America, His Excellency Mr. Amir Mailmon, the Ambassador of Israel, members of the Diplomatic Corps, the Honourable Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister, General Angus Campbell, Chief of the Defence Force, senior members of the Australian Defence Force, Lieutenant General Kamal Yeni, the Commander of the Aegean Army, Turkey, the Honourable Kim Beazley, Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial. To the staff and volunteers of the War Memorial, thank you for your dedication. Staff and members of the Returned Services Leagues, to our veterans, servicemen and women and their families. It's always an honour and a privilege to participate in one of our nation's most solemn and important ceremonies. On Anzac Day, we come together to honour those who have served, those who continue to serve, and importantly, the families that support them. We reflect on their collective sacrifices and what their service has meant to our nation. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the end of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. Today, I particularly want to acknowledge the service of more than 60,000 Australians who served in that conflict, the 523 men who gave their lives in the service of our nation, the impact of that service and loss on their loved ones, and the physical and mental trauma that many carried and many still carry. There is a second anniversary being marked today. Earlier, I had the great privilege of leading the contingent marching to mark the 30th anniversary of Australia's commitment to Somalia. They're marching for each other and in memory of Lieutenant Corporal Shannon McElhaney. Vietnam and Somalian operations were different in scale, duration and intensity, but they were very strongly linked. They are linked because it was Vietnam veterans who taught the Somalia generation of servicemen and women our military skills and what it means to wear your country's uniform. In my own experience, one of my small arms or weapons instructors at Duntroon was Warrant Officer Class 2, Keith Payne, Victoria Cross. In the first platoon I commanded after graduation, my platoon sergeant and section commanders were all veterans of the Vietnam War. Like many others at the time, I was fortunate to be schooled by those with deep military and combat experience. Each generation learns from those who have served before, just as the Vietnam generation learnt from those who had served in the Second World War, Korea, and on the Malay Peninsula. We are also linked by the shared experience of serving together, perhaps that emotion we refer to as mateship. Marching with your mates is one of the most satisfying of life's experiences. The mix of feelings I have today would be common to all veterans. The pleasure of seeing old friends and colleagues, pride in the job undertaken for Australia in difficult circumstances, and in the shared and private moments of reflection on our service and of those no longer with us. And there is another intangible link. Australian servicemen and women are custodians of a legacy that began more than 100 years ago. Regardless of when or where service occurred, whether it was you who wore the uniform or a loved one, or if you simply acknowledge what service of others has meant to our country, all Australians own and are part of the same legacy, the Anzac legacy. Indeed, many of my soldiers before we deployed, when talking with them, when you ask them what were they most concerned about, it wasn't about them, it was about whether they would be good enough to uphold the legacy that had been passed to them. Anzac Day brings that legacy into focus. And the effect of that legacy goes beyond military service though. It's inherent in who we are and who we aspire to be as Australians. We see the characteristics we ascribe to the Anzac legacy, mateship, sacrifice, courage and endurance expressed across our communities. As a nation, we have seen examples of that legacy in the way we responded to cyclones, floods, the pandemic, fire and drought. And today I want to particularly highlight a great Australian organisation that embodies that legacy, Legacy Australia. A great Australian organisation that this year celebrates 100 years of service to our country. Legacy is underpinned by the compassion, the generosity and the determination of generations of Australians fulfilling the promise made to a dying comrade in the trenches of the West, on the Western Front. I'll look after the missus and the kids. It's a commitment that endures to this day as Legacy supports the families of our modern veterans. We are a people who care and we look after our mates and our neighbours. That is part of the Anzac legacy that we are all part of and that we all own. In this centenary year, I encourage all Australians to continue to support Legacy Australia. We owe a great debt to those who have served our nation and to their families. We particularly note the service of Vietnam and Somalia veterans today and their families and thank them for their contribution to our nation. I extend a heartfelt thank you to all veterans and current serving women of the Australian Defence Force. Lest we forget.
Your Excellency, thank you for sharing your insights, your wisdom and your experiences. His Excellency General the Honourable David Hurley, the Honourable Kim Beazley, Mr Matt Anderson and their guests will now make their way into the Hall of Memory to lay floral tributes at the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this morning's commemorations. The memorials galleries and commemorative area will open to visitors who have entry tickets at 12 p.m. Now, please be advised that all visitation sessions are fully booked today. Free entry tickets for future sessions are available on the memorials website. On behalf of the Chairman, the Honourable Kim Beazley, Director Matt Anderson and the staff and volunteers of the Australian War Memorial, thank you to each and every one of you for joining us here on this special morning.